Welcome everyone to our webinar on using supply chain data for good. It's about how clever methodologies can expose social and environmental impacts caused by our everyday consumption choices. We've still got a few people joining onto the webinar, but I'll just be going through a bit of admin for the first few minutes. So my name is Sylvia Howes and I'm from Data for Good. Data for Good is a not-for-profit organisation, and our mission is to inspire and enable people with access to data or who have data skills to use those to benefit humanity and the world. So basically connecting the right people with the right data to tackle global issues. A quick bit of admin, we'll be presenting this webinar today in webinar format, which means your videos and microphones will be off. So don't worry, we can't see you. But if you have any questions, then please type them in the Q&A box and down the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering those after the presentation. But please type them as you think of them so they're fresh in your mind. And that means that we can make sure that we can get through as many questions as possible at the end. So welcome everyone. I'm joining from the lands of the Wongal clan of the Eora Nation, with my hosts Samantha and Kiani joining from the Dharawal clan of the Eora Nation. For this webinar, we're joined together from different countries, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands that we're joining from today, particularly the Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Maori people attending this webinar. So welcome and kia ora. We pay our respects to the elders across all lands who guided and nursed country for many years. We pay our respects to their present elders who continue to pass on knowledge and provide guidance that we can all learn from. And we pay our respects to emerging community elders. We hope they continue to find means through which their voices are heard. Now, our speaker today is Amanda Irwin. Amanda is a PhD student at the University of Sydney, researching the impact of global consumption on biodiversity loss. She returned to university studies after more than 25 years in the corporate world to follow her passion for nature conservation. This corporate experience, combined with her leadership skills and a drive to follow her passion, lead to a wealth of knowledge that can inspire positive impacts. We're very excited to have her and to share her knowledge with you. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Darug people, which is the land that I'm joining you from today. And for my seminar, I'm actually going to take you through two different parts. It's going to be broken into two sections. In the first one, I'm going to talk you through some methodology that we use for supply chain analysis. And in the second part, I'll take you through some findings from research. So findings from my own research, but also findings from other researchers who've used that same methodology to analyze supply chain data. So to get started, I have a very simplistic supply chain to help us think through what we mean when we talk about supply chains. So as an example, I've picked Nutrigrain, a breakfast cereal that we have here in Australia. And if you think about it from a very, very simplistic point of view, ignore the packaging for a minute and all the other smaller ingredients that go into Nutrigrain. To make some Nutrigrain, you really only need three things: some flour, some sugar, and some molasses to hold it all together. So if we think about very simplistically, again, what goes into making the Nutrigrain, we think of those three key ingredients. If we think a little bit harder, we realize there are more things than just the ingredients that need to go into some Nutrigrain. So we need some people to operate the machinery or to tip those ingredients into the machinery. We need some machinery to do that work, and we need some electricity to run that machinery. We also need a whole lot of professional services to support all of that operation. So I've used an example there of an insurance policy, but there are accountants, there are lawyers, there's a whole lot of other professional services that support converting those raw materials into the Nutrigrain. So if we think about the supply chains that exist behind this, again, very simplistic one, and we think about it one step at a time, if we have these three different kinds of raw materials, behind them, we have the actual ingredients or the raw materials that go into them. So from a flour point of view, we need some grain, we need some wheat, we need some barley, whatever that flour is made out of. For the sugar, we need the sugar cane. For the molasses, we also need the sugar cane. We need the crushed sugar cane behind it. So from a raw ingredients point of view, we've gone one step back and we know we need this material. If we think about the people who are operating the machinery to turn those ingredients into the Nutrigrain, there's a whole lot of things that go behind them to support them. I've been a little bit optimistic here because I could only find an icon for a cake, but most of those people are going to have a tea room that they go back to. So their employer has provided them with tea and coffee, maybe even some biscuits to keep them going. There's also some transport that goes into getting them to work, or having their salespeople fly around the country to meet with different customers who are going to sell the Nutrigrain, or having their executives jet off to the US to have their conferences. There's some travel there. There's also some equipment, office equipment, computers that are needed to keep the office working, and paper to keep them going, or to print the rosters on. So as we go back another layer in the supply chain, we see there's actually a whole lot of other bits and pieces that are needed to sustain those people. If we think about the electricity that is required to run the machinery, there's also another step back from them. And again, this is very simplified. To generate that electricity, let's assume it's in New South Wales or Victoria, most of that's going to come from coal. So we need some coal for that electricity. We need some transmission wires to get the electricity from the power station to the factory. And then again, we go behind that. Those transmission wires need some people to look after them. Those people also have a tea room. Those people also need to travel. They also need paper. They also need computers. If we think about the machinery that is used to convert those raw materials into the Nutrigrain, that needs to be manufactured at some point in time. So there are ingredients that go into making that machinery. You can probably see where I'm going with this. It becomes quite recursive as you work back through the supply chain. So there are people needed to manufacture that machinery, and those people need food, those people need office equipment. We also need some steel to manufacture that machinery, and that steel needs raw ingredients or raw materials like iron ore and coal as well. It also needs electricity, and that electricity needs transmission wires, which has people behind it, et cetera, et cetera. So as we think about a very simplified supply chain here, you can see how quickly that multiplies out to all the different inputs. So it gets quite tricky to work out how do we keep track of all those transactions. So let me show that in a different way. And this time I'm going to show it in terms of the money, the flow of money. So in my previous slide, I showed the flow of materials or inputs into that supply chain. But if we think about it in terms of the flow of money, which is equally as valid because each of those materials costs money. So the manufacturer is paying money to the flour provider is paying money to the electricity provider. So if we now think about looking at that money as it flows through, and I've got some pretty primitive, animations here, which aren't working particularly well. But anyway, I think you get the idea. At the point of final demand, you have a consumer who is spending money on that Nutrigrain. To manufacture that Nutrigrain, the supplier needs to spend money on its first layer, its production layer 1, to get the inputs that it's using. And again, I've done it very simple. I've only got 5 inputs at that first production layer, but you can see how quickly those production layers expand. And here we're tracking the money. So we're saying the final demand comes to Nutrigrain. Nutrigrain spends money on input 3. The supplier of input 3 spends money on their own input 1, 2, and 3, et cetera, and so on up through the production layers. So we have money being transacted across the economy to eventually get us to the point where we have 1 box of Nutrigrain. At the same time, there are impacts that are occurring over those supply chains. And again, it's quite simplistic here, but I've picked 3 potential impacts. And the first one there is a workplace accident. So let's imagine there's a workplace accident at the factory that's manufacturing the food processing machinery. So not at the factory that's making the Nutrigrain, but at the factory that was making the machinery that was then bought by Kellogg's to make their Nutrigrain. So that workplace injury, a little tiny bit of that is then embodied in the final Nutrigrain box. Let's assume that there are some trees that are cut down to make the pulp that is used to make the paper that the roster is printed on, and some animals lost their habitat and then became closer to extinction. And I used a koala here, but it could be any animal. So that loss of habitat, that tiny percentage of that loss of habitat can also be attributed to the Nutrigrain. And then finally, you would have noticed even in that really simple supply chain, there was a lot of electricity production. And in a coal-fired electricity market, that means there are a lot of greenhouse gases emitted as that electricity is produced. So a small chunk of those greenhouse gases are also attributable at the end to the Nutrigrain. So how do we start accounting for these impacts? We can work out how to account for the money relatively simply because the manufacturer or the company is going to keep track of where its money goes. but how do we account for the impacts that happen across that supply chain? And there are two ways that we can do that. Whoops, there we go. We can account for those impacts from a production-based point of view, but also from a consumption-based point of view. And the production-based one is pretty intuitive. And in terms of greenhouse gases, that's also how the Paris Agreement works, for example. And that says that the point where the greenhouse gases are emitted is where it should be accounted for. So I have a picture here of a coal-fired power station in the Hunter Valley. It's pretty straightforward to measure those emissions. We can then say those emissions should be accounted for at the point where they're produced. If we want to look at a consumption-based accounting point of view, effectively what we're saying is that this poor kid should bear some of the responsibility for those greenhouse gases emitted. And it's obviously going to be a very small chunk of those greenhouse gases emitted. But if he hadn't chosen to have Nutrigrain for breakfast, a small point of those greenhouse gas emitted might have been avoided. So I'm going to talk through how we start to measure the production-based and the consumption-based accounting. Now, the short answer on the production-based accounting is actually very straightforward. It's not particularly complicated. We have methodologies for helping us do that. And I've used, as an example here, the production-based accounting of greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. The government measures that in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. This is the latest report up there on the website at the moment, which shows you what percentage of greenhouse gases were emitted for each of the big sectors in the Australian economy. So you can see there that the greatest share of greenhouse emissions comes from the electricity sector. And you can see all the other sectors there. So getting the information on those production-based impacts or the production-based accounting is pretty straightforward. We do a good job of measuring that. Under the Paris Agreement, we measure that. So we can get hold of that. But the consumption-based accounting, as you can probably imagine, based on my very simplified diagrams, is a little bit harder to measure. So what data can we use to help us do consumption-based accounting? Well, the good news is we already have one part of that data, which is those production-based accounts. So we need to have a quantifiable version of that impact to start with, or there's no point running it through the consumption-based accounting. The second bit of data that we need is information on that flow of money through the economy. So the Kellogg's knows how much they spent on their employees. They know how much they spent on buying flour, for example. We need to get hold of that information, those economic transactions. And that may seem quite daunting. How do we go? Do we go and talk to every manufacturer of every product? Do we go and talk to every consumer to work out how much they spent on Nutrigrain versus Sultana brand? How do we get hold of that data? And the exciting news is it's actually pretty straightforward. Because it's economic data and our society values economic data, we like to work out where our money goes. This information exists in the system of national accounts. The ABS takes care of it for us here in Australia, but most countries also have their own statistical agencies who look after this and collate that information. And in the system of national accounts, they store this information in what is known as input-output tables. And so I've put a very simplistic diagram here to try and explain where that data sits and how it works. And in my simplistic diagram here in this one country economy, I've noted that we have 5 economic sectors, so very, very high level. And we know that each economic sector spends money on every other economic sector. And those dollar amounts are captured in each of these boxes or on the spreadsheet, those cells on the spreadsheet. So we can work out how much does sector 1 spend on itself, how much does it spend on sector 2, and so on. And all this data together makes up an input-output table. And if we go across the rows here, so let's choose sector 2. If we go across the rows here and follow this arrow, that gives us information on which sectors its output is being allocated to. So the total output across sector 2 is, if we go across the rows, we can see the output allocated to each other sector, but we can also see the output that gets allocated to final demand, which is the point at which we as consumers are buying the product, or government is spending money, or there's some kind of capital investment. So if we go across the rows here, we have the total output of the economic sector. If we go down the columns, we have the total input of the economic sector. So this is what sector 2 produces going across the rows, but it requires inputs from every other sector to produce its output. And we can get that information by going down the columns. And down the bottom here, we have what is known as the value added block. And that's just picking up other interactions in the economy which are not taking place between different sectors. So that's where things like the compensation of employees is captured, and it's also places where taxes are captured, because that expenditure is not happening between sectors. It's happening between sectors or industries and other stakeholders. But that money needs to be spent. The Kellogg's can't make the Nutrigrain without paying people to operate the machinery. It also needs to pay taxes to the government. So that's a very simplified 1 country 5 sector input-output table. And it gets really, really interesting when we start to put more than 1 country together. So again, you can see how quickly this gets complicated. We can now have a look at input-output tables from more than 1 country, because in our input-output tables, we also keep track of the value of exports and the value of imports. So we have an idea of how much money is leaving Australia to buy products from other countries, and how much money is coming into Australia when we're selling our goods and services to other countries. And most other countries keep track of that information. So we can do some pretty funky algorithms to bring all that information together into what are known as multi-region input-output tables. So again, I'm staying with the simplistic example here and saying that we've now got 3 countries, and each of them have 5 sectors. And we can track what are the interactions between each of those sectors within a country, but also between sectors as we move across countries. And you can see on the diagonal there, shaded in that light green, light blue, is the value of all the domestic transactions. So this is the economic interactions that are happening within the country. If we move across, you can then start to see what are the exports from country 1 to country 2 or to country 3. And what are the exports from country 3 to country 1 and country 2. And you can start to see that when that grid, those grids are, and imagine those grids are all filled with numbers which represent the value of those transactions. It's very, very, very powerful data that gives us a snapshot of an economy of those 3 countries. And we have researchers who've pulled that together to do it on the total global economy. Now, we also still have the value added block down the bottom to represent those other inputs to production. And we have the final demand block over here on the right, which is where the final consumption takes place. So we know what the final demand for each sector in each country is. So that gives us that economic data. So those little magic dollars working through my supply chain tree, if you like, we get that information from multi-region input-output tables. And we can start to do consumption-based accounting when we add at the bottom of that table the production-based measure. If you remember, I said we would take that. So in my greenhouse gas example, greenhouse gas emissions example, we have information on how much greenhouse gases are emitted by sector in the Australian economy. And so we can add that data along here on the bottom to say, okay, the greenhouse gases emitted by the electricity in Australia are X. We put them under the sector here, which represents the greenhouse gases. And then we can connect that information to all that economic activity and follow it through those amazingly complicated paths out to final demand. And we can work out how much of that impact, that production-based measure, is attributable to that final demand. Now, there is one thing we have to make sure of, and this is a limitation of this methodology, is that those production-based measures, or the data in there, can be connected to economic activity. So there are some impacts that are felt which we can't directly attribute to economic activity, and they are therefore excluded. So in my research on extinction risk, for example, and even if we take Australia as an example, there are a lot of threats acting on species. And in Australia, one of the huge threats acting on species is invasive species, in particular feral cats and foxes. And we know that's an impact, and that's driving quite a bit of the extinction risk. But there's no way for us to connect foxes or cats into economic activity. So the limitation of this methodology finds its place there when we can't connect the production-based measure into economic activity. So we've got our really big, complicated, huge Excel spreadsheet, which gives us all this information. It gives us the economic information, and we also have our production-based measure. How do we turn that into a footprint? First of all, we need to name. I'm going to take you through the maths, but just very top level. First of all, we need to name each of the things that we have here. It's a good little bit of algebra. So we're going to call this big block in the middle with all those transactions between sectors the T. We're going to call the final demand block the Y block. We'll call the value added block V, and we'll call the production-based measure, or what is known as the satellite block, as Q. And then we do some really funky maths, which was discovered by or created by Leontief back in the 50s. And then he connected that to environmental impact in the 70s. And he actually won a Nobel Prize for this work. And it's quite simple. I've put a little hashtag there, or a disclaimer, to say that I've simplified it for communication, but really the only form of simplification is that this is these are matrix operations rather than straightforward arithmetic, because as you saw there, those matrices are huge, so you can't just add T and Y like you add 1 and 2. So there is a little bit of matrix magic, matrix manipulation that needs to happen. But at the end of the day, we actually have all the information from that chart before. We have the T, we have the Y, and we have the Q. And from those three things, we can derive the footprint. And the formula that we use for that is this one. This is footprint equals little q times L times Y. And I'm happy to follow up with any specific questions on the maths of that if you're really keen, but I think for the purposes of today, I won't do that. But I have also put some references there if you're keen to understand that in a little bit more detail. So the next question you're probably asking is, oh, okay, even if I don't worry about the maths too much, where do I start to get that information from? I'm saying it's relatively straightforward once you have the information. Where can we find it? So if we wanted to do a footprint for greenhouse gas emissions, otherwise known as a carbon footprint in Australia, we have that information already. The ABS controls or supplies input-output tables as part of the Australian national accounts. And actually, this is the same information that they use to calculate our GDP. So there's a lot of rigor that goes into pulling this data together because it's used for economic purposes as well. So those national accounts and the input-output tables are a huge part of the input there. That gives us the T. The Q, or the impact, the measure of the impact, if we wanted to do greenhouse gases, would come from here. We have that information. I've put that up there as a percentage of the total, but you can get the absolute value of the total as well. And the last bit of information is we need is the consumption block, or the Y matrix. Now that's also available in those input-output tables from a total Australia point of view, but you could also do that for yourself. If you kept track of where your money went in a year against each of the economic sectors in the input-output tables, you could calculate your own carbon footprint based on your small amount of consumption or your share of total Australia consumption. So that's looking at one particular environmental metric. We can also look at sort of social impacts. So I mentioned before, we might want to have a look at workplace accidents. And again, the ABS gives us information on that. So there's information there on workplace accidents in a year by sector. It also has it by gender, in case that's interesting as well. And again, we can get our consumption data from the input-output tables or from our own consumption. And we can see how much we are implicated in workplace accidents based on what we spend our money on. So there's two examples. Data already exists in Australia, publicly available. You could go and do that tomorrow if you wanted to, and you were comfortable with matrix manipulation. And then if we want to go global, so to move to that multi-region input-output table, there are also, there's probably 4 or 5 well-known global input-output tables. These all exist within a research setting, so they're not readily available in a commercial setting. But the one that I've used for my research is the Aurora database, which was put together by researchers from Sydney Uni, and it covers 190 countries. So that allows me to do some research looking at the extinction risk across 190 countries. I've put here as an example data that's also readily available on modern slavery. So the Walk Free Foundation pulled this information together to estimate the number of people in modern slavery in each country. So we can use our Q block now as a modern slavery one rather than a greenhouse gas one. And again, we get that consumption data, either our own consumption data or the Aurora database has that as well. So that's a very brief overview of the methodology that goes into footprinting. If you have any questions, make sure you put them into the Q&A so that we can come to them at the end. Now what I'm going to do is shift to sharing some results from research. So I've given you an oversight of how that data can be used to generate the footprints. And now I'm sure you're interested in finding out what were the findings of some of this data. And there's actually quite a lot of research out there dealing in input-output methodology. But what I thought I would do was share some results looking at environmental footprints and share some results looking at social footprints, just to give you a flavour for how that same methodology can give us answers to different kinds of questions. So if I have a look, if we think about, again, we'll talk about greenhouse gas emissions or carbon footprint, because this is news here in Australia a lot, particularly in the lead up to Glasgow and whether our Prime Minister will choose to go or not go. And he's got some interesting points about Australia's role in reducing carbon emissions. But the information on production-based accounting for carbon is also widely available. And I've taken this chart from Our World in Data, freely available. And this is 2016 data on total greenhouse gas emissions by country. And the darker the colour, the higher the value. So this paints a picture, not a surprise, that both China and the US are high in terms of production-based greenhouse gas emissions. And Australia is actually pretty high. And you probably all know if you put that on a per capita basis, we are very, very high, like at the top of the list. But when you look at it from a production point of view, you kind of go, wow, okay, well, the people who need to be doing something about that are China and the US. We're not so bad. If you have a look at it from a consumption-based point of view, the picture changes. And this is some research that was done in 2017, looking at consumption-based carbon footprints. And the underlying data is from a different time period than the chart before, so they're not directly comparable. But what these researchers found was that a large chunk of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with Chinese production are actually being exported out of China to other countries, and they're embodied in all the goods that people buy. And the arrows here represent the size of that kind of transfer of greenhouse gases. And you can see the biggest chunk goes out to the US. So not only is the US a huge producer in its own right from a production-based point of view, but it's also picking up or responsible for greenhouse gas emissions from China in the products that it's importing from China. And you can see there that those flows also go to Japan. There's a bit of backwards and forwards with South Korea. It's going across to Germany. The USA itself is importing greenhouse gas emissions from Canada and Mexico, but also sending some back over the border to Canada. Unfortunately, the flows into Australia weren't big enough to show up on their map because they were only looking at fluxes greater than 70 megatons of CO2, but we would obviously show up there as well. Some other research that had a look at this difference and kind of put it a little bit more together was having a look at both the territorial emissions and the consumption-based emissions by the countries in their scope of their analysis, and Australia is not showing up there either. And they were positioning this against the Kyoto target. And so that with the Kyoto Protocol is a predecessor to the Paris Agreement. And what that little dot, or the circle with the dot in the middle, represents is the change in greenhouse gas emissions that these countries committed to under the Kyoto Protocol. And the blue line represents what the actual change in their territorial emissions were. And the black line represents what their change in consumption-based emissions were. So if we have a look at, say, the UK, you can see there that their Kyoto target was down there, I don't know, I'm going to guess about 12% reduction. And they overshot that. They did a great job if you look at it from a territorial emissions point of view. But if you look across, you can see that from a consumption-based point of view, they actually grew more than 20%. So while they can then say, look at us, aren't we amazing? We over-delivered our Kyoto target. Actually, in terms of the consumption-based emissions, they went the other way. And you can see there's a different profile of different countries as well. So keeping track of the consumption-based accounting as well as the production-based accounting gives us a much clearer picture of how these things are actually working as they go across the economy. And because we are looking at that economic data by country and by sector, we can also cut this by sector, not just by country. And this is coming from a different set of researchers again. So the data isn't necessarily using the same base information, but it's using the same methodology to give us some insights into which sectors are the greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So if we go down to that bottom left graph to start off with, you can see that these researchers have divided the consumption into households, government, and investors. So households is people like us when we go and spend our money. Governments is what the government spends their money on. And investment is basically where the dollars are going from an investment point of view or a capital formation point of view. And the different colours represent different sectors, which are over in that legend on the right. If you have a look from a household point of view, the biggest chunk of greenhouse gases globally are driven by householders spending money on shelter, that medium blue colour, and spending money on food. So the biggest contributions that we are making and where we spend our money is the money that we spend on electricity, running the fridges, running the laptops, heating the house, cooling the house, and also on the food that we consume. And you get a little bit of insight into what the food component looks like if you go over up to this top right-hand graph, which is looking at greenhouse gases other than CO2. And if you have a look at a household point of view, you can see the big chunk of that is the light blue color, which is the food. So a lot of the money that we are spending on food is generating a big impact in terms of non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, which is most likely methane. Because cattle production generates a whole lot of methane as the cows are processing the grass. So there are some things that we can do from a consumption point of view once we know this and we understand the biggest contribution that our small amounts of money are adding up to from a greenhouse gas contribution. So that's an overview of the first environmental footprint, carbon footprints. Next, I wanted to talk about extinction risk footprints, and this is a bit of a sneak peek into my research. So it's not yet published, so it's not all fancy. But what we've done in our research is have a look at how to quantify extinction risk footprint and then look at it from a production point of view and a consumption point of view. And the raw data that we're using to generate this footprint is information that comes from the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. And that contains information on the extinction risk of, I think it's up to 130 or 140,000 species across the country, across the world. And our research focused in on mammals, birds, and amphibians. And we use the data in the red list to quantify an extinction risk footprint. In this graph here, or in this chart here, you can see the darker the color, the higher the footprint. And this is from a production-based point of view. And you can see most of the impact, or the big chunk of impact, is coming from Colombia, Brazil, Madagascar, and Indonesia. And that's because there are a lot of threatened species there with a lot of threats working on them. If you have a look from a consumption-based point of view, you can see again the shift away. Those countries are still high from a consumption-based point of view, but we also see a transition to the US and to China. And perhaps a better way to illustrate that is here where we've categorized countries. What we've done here is highlighted or color-coded those countries in green who are net exporters of extinction risk footprint, which means that the things that they trade with other countries have a lot of extinction risk embodied in them. The ones that are orange are the ones that are importing a lot of extinction risk footprint. And you can see again, North America, Europe, and over here, Japan and South Korea and some of the other Asian countries. And then the blue countries are those that have the main impact on extinction risk is coming from their own domestic consumption. So we can get an insight into how that shifts, and that we're hoping will start to inform some policy choices. So if I was setting up policies in Madagascar, I'd probably be tapping my trade partners on the shoulder and saying, could you please help us invest in the country to help us protect our wildlife and our nature? If I was in a country that had a huge domestic footprint, extinction risk footprint, I'd be having a look at my own internal supply chains and what are the protections there. And if I was setting policy in a country which was a high importer of extinction risk footprint, I'd be looking at how can I invest? Where do I invest my CSR money to help make the biggest impact on protecting the biodiversity in the countries which I'm importing for? And then for our research, we also had a look at it from a sector value. And here you can see that the food and beverage and agricultural sectors also have the biggest impact on biodiversity loss, which doesn't really it makes sense because we know that food and agriculture, we clear land. We kind of make it very monoculture. We don't have the same rich ecosystems where we're producing the materials that go into our food and beverage and agricultural supply chains. But in terms of impact for us, watching out how we spend our money on those sectors will help us think about the environmental impacts we can have. So that's having a look at environmental footprints. Remember to shoot any questions through. I'm mindful of the time, so I might start speaking a little bit quicker because the next one is also really interesting in terms of social footprints. And this was done very, very recently. It's only just come out, looking at the modern slavery footprint. And these researchers have had a look at, again, that same principle of where is the consumption coming from that is generating a modern slavery footprint. And this chart here is color-coded. So the darker the color, the higher the modern slavery footprint. And you can see there the countries, again, whose consumption is driving a modern slavery. So people who are in forced labor around the world. And you can see there again, unfortunately, we show up quite high. The next slide shows you again that dynamic of where the production impact is. So where are the people actually enslaved, and where is the modern slavery footprint being exported from and to? And you can see they're color-coded red are the countries which are net exporters of modern slavery, and the blue ones are the countries that are net importers of modern slavery. And that research, they were also able to have a look at the sectors. And you can see here how that changes. If you look at it from a production point of view, where some of the biggest chunks of the footprints down, and they transition as that money flows all the way through the global economy. You can see that modern slavery footprint actually shows up in things like services and manufacturing when it wasn't so high from a production point of view. So we get this really amazing data that shows us what are the sectors where we're spending our money, where we have the modern slavery footprint embedded. We can also do that. Another researcher here, group of researchers who've done that from corruption footprint using the same methodology. I won't spend too much time on that because I can see my time is nearly up. And then to finish it off, I thought I would share this piece of research with you, which is also pretty recent. It was done last year though, so it's having a look at using that input-output methodology, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. It was 2020, so it was kind of act one of the pandemic. I think if we did it again, we might see different results. But here they've put a whole lot of different impacts together. So using that same input-output methodology, what was the impact of COVID-19 on consumption loss in red? So where did people start spending less money? In the kind of brownie olive color there, where was income loss? Which countries had the highest income loss? And then in yellow, which countries had the highest employment loss? So looking at some economic and some social impacts as well. And across the bottom, we're also looking at environmental impacts. So where did we see greenhouse gas reductions? So good news, greenhouse gas emissions were reduced because there wasn't so much economic activity. The particulate matter was reduced, and also other air pollutions like sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides. So this, you can see here, these guys have put their input-output methodology and put a whole lot of different information at the bottom there to try and pull out what kind of impact that the change in economic activity had, looking at it from a social and an environmental point of view. So to finish it off, I thought what I might do is just a few little tips here. These are just Amanda's thoughts, because when you look through that data, sometimes it feels quite bleak. It feels like, wow, everything that we spend our money on has a negative impact. And actually that's true. Every bit of material that we use, everything we eat, everything that we have around us came from the natural environment at some point in time and was transformed into the product that we use through the hands of people and using energy. So everything that we have or everything that we spend our money on has an impact. So the top tip really there is to consume less. Don't buy stuff unless you really need to, so that you can start to minimize your footprint. What the research would say from a carbon footprint point of view would be minimize electricity consumption, particularly if you're in Australia and particularly if you're in New South Wales and Victoria. If you can, install solar and batteries. But again, there are some modern slavery implications in solar, so you do have to do a little bit of homework there, and minimize red meat consumption because those cows are making a lot of methane out there. From a biodiversity point of view, minimizing food waste, again, everything that we eat has had an environmental cost. So if you're going to buy food, make sure you eat it, and minimize red meat consumption there as well, because that shows up with an impact on biodiversity. And from a modern slavery point of view, to see how you can go about using responsibly sourced materials, do some research on where the materials that you're buying are sourced from and the products that you're buying, where they source their materials from. And in particular, avoid fast fashion. And the tip here, the tip I give my kids is if something's really cheap, that probably means that somebody hasn't been paid properly within the supply chain at best. At worst, it means probably someone's enslaved to put that garment together for you. So there's some tips based on that research. That's all from me. So I might stop there and hand over to see if there are any questions. So.
Yeah, Amanda, that's sometimes you just hear all that information and you're like, exactly like you said, you're sort of aware of your consumption, and it's funny that you picked the Nutri-Grain as the example, because that's what I did this morning. It wasn't Nutri-Grain, but I remember looking at my cereal going, so much went into this that I'm not even aware of. And that's just for one meal. And I'm one of billions of people. So there's a lot to take in. We've got to be more aware of our consumptions. And so one of the questions here is, how do we educate people on the importance of taking a consumption-based view of environmental and social issues? So obviously all the participants here today have got some sort of interest in it. How do we educate others on the importance of this?
I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, from a research point of view, what we hope to do is publish our research and disseminate our research like I'm doing today, so that more and more people are aware of it. I think from an everyday point of view, it's just having those conversations. It's just stopping to think about, wow, where did this come from? You know, I have an iPhone here. Where did that come from? Where was it manufactured? What went into that? And I often think about it in terms of, when I watch the news, I have a little bit of a rant. If certain politicians start talking about the fact that China we can't do anything because China is the world's greatest greenhouse gas emitter. It's just having conversations with other people saying, I wonder why they're emitting that much greenhouse gas. Yeah. What is good? So it's just asking that next question, the why. It's kind of like a why analysis that you often do in business. So, well, why is that? Why do we have this? Why is that? Why do we not want to eat red? Why do people talk about not wanting to eat red meat? Is it because they're really just, politically correct, or are there actually environmental concerns on that? So I think for me, it's just about conversations. I feel like once I know something, it's kind of my duty to talk about that with people when it comes up in conversation.
Yeah. And that red meat one does actually come up a lot, because I know with my mother, I'm battling at the moment. She says, but they're now feeding the cows something else. So they're not creating so much methane. They're feeding them seaweed or, kelp or something. Yep. And I say, yeah, but still someone, you got to feed the cows. Yeah. There's still there are other impacts. Yeah. So a lot of people are saying how interesting it is. I think because everyone's involved in consuming. And so another question along those trade connections, there's a lot of people and organizations that profit from that activity. Is there a way to link who profits to those impacts?
That's a good question. I'm sure there would be, but I don't think that information is captured in that supply chain data. So the data that we're using to capture those interactions are those input-output tables. And they're really talking about the expenditure that goes on between each sector. Obviously, all organizations make a profit and they choose what they do with that profit. But that doesn't come into, they don't spend their profit on, they're not spending their profit on buying tea for the tea room. That's on their profit and loss. That's seen as an operating expense. So I suspect there's the potential to then try and, if we could get an understanding of what the profits were or how profitable different sectors were, we could potentially put that as a satellite block on the bottom of our input-output table to be able to trace that through. But I haven't seen that done.
Yeah. And with education and the community, so this is just another question that's come through, can being conscious only do so much? Like, are the real systemic changes to do with are they in the hands of the policymakers, like corrupt politicians, like selfish and corrupt politicians? Like, are they the key people who need to make changes? Like how much can we do and how much is them?
Yeah, I actually think there's probably three key stakeholders here, or actors here. So there's certainly the changes that we can make, but again, we're in the grand scheme of things, we're spending very little money, right? It's a lot of money to us as a household, but when you add all of us together, it's still not that much, but it is something. So if everybody eats one less red meat meal per week, and that will all add up. So I think there is certainly something that we can do from a personal point of view. I think there's also very much things that policymakers can do, and that helps in two ways. The first is changing the conversation, and the media as well. So changing the conversation around from, well, you know, we're so small, we don't make a difference, to even if we are small, we want to make a difference. So I think there's that language change. And then also, obviously, the policy levers that the government puts in place can be. So do we have subsidies on fossil fuel industry, or do we have subsidies on the electric vehicle industry? So there are some choices that government makes with their policy mechanisms, and obviously that will be really helpful because that changes both consumer behaviour but also corporate behaviour. But I think the one that doesn't get talked about enough is what big organisations or corporations or companies can do. And while they are responsible most of the time to their shareholders to make sure that they do deliver a profit, they also have this social license. So, you know, we should make our choices on who we invest with, or whether we shop at Woolies or whether we shop at Coles, you know, things like that. There are corporations out there with a lot of money, and they spend a lot of money from a CSR point of view. Are there things that they can do, and they can lead the way around either creating a not-for-profit foundation or subsidising particular organisations who do research on this particular area? So I think there's this whole kind of private enterprise where most of the money in our economy actually sits. If you think about it, it sits in those big corporations, and most of them mean well and they want to make a positive contribution to society. So I think it's also helping them think about how can they leverage the scale that they have in terms of the money that's available to them, or the size of their employees. How can we really help them to understand where they can make a difference as well? So I think it's all three areas that need to change. Yeah,
for sure. And when we were talking about slavery, or you were mentioning slavery, something that surprised me that I read about recently is that slavery is not just people being underpaid, it's people who are in servitude who aren't able to escape their situation. So when you're taking slavery, it's one section of people, and then but on top of that, in terms of what we'd consider as inhumane conditions, that's a broader group again. So all those statistics we're looking at around slavery, you're talking about, just to clarify, you're talking about people who are in the worst.
Absolutely. So I think, and again, it's not my research, but my understanding of how they define modern slavery in their research was how it's defined in the Modern Slavery Act, which came into effect in Australia in 2018. And that makes a distinction between people who are in bad employment conditions. So, you know, they're not paid overtime or things, but they still have the ability to leave their job. That's not defined as modern slavery. Modern slavery is being in a situation where you actually cannot leave your job. You're in a situation where you can't escape. It also includes forced marriage, or, you know, child marriage. However, that's not included in that research because we need to be able to connect it into economic activity. And forced marriage is normally not driven by economic activity, but child labour, going down the mines, you know, in Democratic Republic of Congo, that would be considered modern slavery as well. So if you're interested in that definition, I'd have a look at the text of the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, because they do make that differentiation.
Yeah, and things have been very interesting since they introduced that act, because it's impacted a large number of corporations than would have originally been considered to be impacted by it, because they are reporting on all their different tiers of suppliers.
Yeah,
so it is actually filtering down to show a lot of transparency in a lot of different corporations.
Yeah,
which is really
absolutely.
good.
Yeah.
So someone's asked if you've found any particularly interesting findings in your research, any countries or sectors having a greater impact than you would have thought, particularly in the area of biodiversity loss.
Yes, many interesting findings. So where to pick it? I think the one that I found very interesting is, if you remember my chart, Madagascar was very dark green. When you have a look at Madagascar, the extinction risk footprint in Madagascar, only 34% of that comes from consumption in Madagascar. So 66% of that footprint, or the extinction risk, is being exported to other countries. So the US, France in particular. So there's something there, and I don't know, I haven't researched it, but it feels like there is some kind of colonial hangover on some of those international trade routes. So France and Madagascar, it used to be a French colony, and now they still have a lot of trade connections there. And we found that in some of the other countries as well, is that you can find where you have these interesting trade connections happening across countries, and you can see that's where the biodiversity flows. I think the other thing that I found interesting was that if you remember my chart on the sectors that had the biggest impact, globally, food and agriculture have the biggest impact. In Australia, which is another bit of research that I've done, it's actually the construction sector that has the biggest impact on the threatened and near threatened species in Australia. So there's different dynamics in terms of the economy and the species, obviously, that happen. So, and I think the koala, and I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but something like 30% of the extinction risk footprint from the koala is coming from Queensland construction, because there's a lot of land being cleared and a lot of new houses being built. So seeing those differences by country has also made me realise how much you have to tailor those policy choices by country or by sector when you identify where they are.
Yeah. So your instruction to go green for those countries would be to tailor the policies.
I think so, absolutely. Yeah. Understand. And again, there's another interesting intersection, and I briefly mentioned it, where if you look at greenhouse gas emissions and say go solar, that we should all go solar, no reason why we can't, particularly in Australia. But if you look at modern slavery research, there's also some pretty heavily implicated modern slavery happening in the solar panel supply chain.
I want to hear that.
So you go, okay, everyone put solar panels on your roof, because then we'll have less greenhouse gas emissions. But if actually the components that are embedded in those supply chains are being manufactured by people in bonded slavery or forced labor camps, then I've done a great job from a greenhouse gas emissions point of view, but I haven't done a great job from a modern slavery point of view. So you really do, to make meaningful policy interventions, you have to understand all this intersection.
Yeah. And I mean, as a consumer, I find that if I'm researching something, sometimes it can take a while to find out where something comes from, and you can almost get sort of fatigued from trying to do a lot of research. So are there, if we're researching individual products, are there areas that you'd suggest that we can go to find out some more information about particular products?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I think I saw some comments coming up. Someone is International Justice Mission. I think if you're concerned with modern slavery, there are some organisations that do a good job of reporting where the modern slavery kind of is, if you like. So not academic research, but sort of looking at where people are freed from slavery or where they know there are particular bonded labour. And you're never going to get 100% research rigorous connection. But if you say, let's make it up, and that a lot of the solar panel components are manufactured in the part of China where we know there's also some questionable human rights stuff going on, then I'm not saying that every panel that comes from that part of China is implicated in modern slavery, but you might go, that looks a little bit sus. But if you can find that the panels are coming from Germany, for example, where there's pretty strong labour protection laws in place, then it's less likely to be an issue. So I think it's probably just having a look, reading what you can from these non-profit organisations who do a lot of heavy lifting on pulling together that grey data, and then superimposing it from where whatever you're looking at is being sourced. Yeah.
So IJM, International Justice Mission, Baptist World Aid have something. Someone suggested as well on the questions, I haven't looked at it personally, but Kogo, to do your footprint, carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of that one? They asked if
I haven't, but that's probably because I haven't looked for a while. There are a couple of places where you can do your carbon footprint.
Yeah. Now this question is really interesting. On the example of South American countries' biodiversity loss risk and the tie into exports, can this consumption-based methodology be used to solve how the South American countries could produce and export something economically viable without the same biodiversity loss risk? So it's looking at an alternative way to do it. So basically in a way that doesn't have those negative social impacts.
Absolutely. But I would point out that those South American countries, and this is something that surprised me, most of their biodiversity loss footprint is coming from domestic consumption. So they actually, Colombia is the country that actually came up with the highest extinction risk footprint of all the countries, and 93% of that was domestic consumption. So for them, I would say it's about having a look at their own internal supply chains. But there obviously are still some biodiversity losses embedded in their exports. And so having a look at what are the products or the commodities that they're exporting and where are they being grown or husbanded. You know, a lot in Brazil, for example, I think, and again, I don't know for sure, a lot of that is to do with soy. So they grow soy, which they then ship to Europe, and Europe feeds that to their cows to create the beef. So the beef that's being consumed in the UK might come from, I don't know, I'll make it up, Germany. And so that transaction is only happening in Europe, but those cows have been fed on soy that was grown in Brazil. So I think in those cases, if I was looking at it from a corporate point of view, I would want to understand, what is my supply chain? Where is that information? Where are the different inputs? And, you know, the big chunks, so something that's more than 50% at a particular layer in the supply chain, where's that coming from? And what's the biodiversity situation in that country, or the modern slavery situation in that country?
Yeah, and I guess that gets pretty tricky, like your example before of Queensland and the construction industry, like, you know, trying to find alternatives. Mm-hmm. Like it seems quite like a basic need to have housing for people, but at the same time, it's got an impact. So
exactly,
I guess that would be an Australian example of that same question.
Yeah, and of course everything has an impact, and I think it's naive to think that we can all just sit in our rooms and not eat anything or not not buy any clothes. Obviously we consume things to keep us going, so it's not that consumption is bad, it's just making sure that we have an understanding of the impacts of our consumption so we can minimize it where we can. And I would say from a construction point of view in Queensland, a lot of that damage is coming because forests are being cut down to build new housing estates. And I know, you know, it's crazy, right? Housing is so expensive, but if you're in a position to say, I'm not going to live in a house that's brand new on a housing estate that's been cleared for, you know, someone else probably will, but I'm choosing to buy an old house or to move into a granny flat in my mum's backyard, or, you know, so there are some choices that we can make, but they can be quite significant. In that case, I actually think the responsibility lies with the policymakers. So local councils, for example, to say, actually, no, I'm not going to approve that development because that is koala habitat and we need to protect it. So it really depends on what the issue is and where the right decision should be. But again, that's just my personal opinion, not my scientifically research-derived opinion.
Yeah, and we're just going to a minute over, but we've got two last questions that I wanted to ask you, if you've got time to
sure
for those last two. So I don't like to get into politics too much, but this question does touch on it slightly, in that the federal government's recently been talking a lot about their greenhouse emissions reductions targets. Mm-hmm. Are the policies supporting those? Like, are they sufficient? Do we have the data? Are we providing them with the data to make the right policies?
Well, I'm not, but I think based on what I know from the data that exists, I think the answer would be no. I don't think we have the right policy mechanisms in place to be able to meet what we need to meet from our country point of view. Part of that is we don't have the right target either. Like our target is inadequate. If you have a look at the recent IPCC report on climate change, our target, which we have set under the Paris Agreement, is woefully inadequate. We won't do our part to keep the world to under 1.5 degree warming. So I would say the first step for Australia, what Australia needs to do is set a target, stop arguing about climate change and just set a target, and then work out how do we get there. Because at the moment, we're still back in this point of, is climate change real or not? Instead of saying we know it is, we need to set a target and then we need to put actions in place. But we're still back here from a political point of view. So we just need someone to say, guys, stop it. We need to set a target. We know it's going to cause pain, but it's going to cause much more pain if we don't do something about climate change.
Yep, agreed. So last question, I think I think it wraps it up nicely, because it sort of comes back to your first example where you had the cereal box and everything, that all the supply chain links that tie to that cereal box. Is, can we measure the impact at a transaction level? Could you go into a store, do some grocery shopping, and then just calculate carbon footprint, for example, just for that transaction?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. You can. So that input-output methodology and that one page of maths that I showed is kind of the first layer, but you can actually do what is called production layer decomposition. So you can go through all those billions of transactions and pick out one and find out what is the impact associated at that particular transaction. So that input-output methodology allows you to do that. How you would operationalize that in terms of, when I go into a grocery store, I want to understand this particular part of the transaction. I haven't seen that done, but it probably has been done. It's just not in my scope of understanding the world. But the methodology certainly exists. And in fact, I used that in another bit of research that I did to track the impact of the Dutch consumption in the Dutch healthcare sector, right down to a gorilla in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can see which expenditure ends up getting you to the point where a gorilla is impacted by someone at the hospital in the Netherlands. So you can make your way through that data, but it's getting really, really fine scale. Yeah.
So I guess you could almost gamify it if you're going into a supermarket. Like, how can you minimize your impact and see
absolutely
what your impact is along the way?
Yeah, you certainly could. But I think the challenge that we have is that this methodology is really quite well understood in the research community and in academia, but it's only just starting to kind of cross over out into the, dare I say, real world, get used in organizations and get used commercially. But I think there's a huge opportunity to take that and apply it much more in everyday settings rather than in the research and academic space.
Yeah. And that's why it's so great that we've got you to present today, because we've got I'm sure everyone who's participated has found it as fascinating as I have. It's eye-opening. It makes you think, and it makes you question your choices. Yeah. And I think having that information is one thing, and then sharing it with others means that it goes on to make a bigger impact. So absolutely. I just wanted to say thanks on behalf of all the participants in Data for Good. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing those insights.
Well, thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
And we'll send the recording out to those people who've registered in the next few days. But thank you so much, Amanda. It means a lot to be educated in this way. So.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for listening and joining us, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Bye.